Good morning, friends. Welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. We're out here in the garden today on this beautiful morning, and it is time for another garden tour. So I'm going to call this one the Late May Garden Tour. Today is May 27th, and this is going to get posted probably a couple days after today. So I just wanted to give you guys an update about how the garden is going. It's finally really starting to look like my garden. We don't have everything planted yet, but we're making a lot of progress. So come hang out with me in the garden and let's take a look. So as we come into the garden, the first bed is this broccoli bed here. Now you can see this broccoli has grown pretty significantly since our last garden tour. It won't be too long before we might start seeing little bits of broccoli heads forming down in the center of the broccoli. I don't see any signs of it yet. Which is actually good, because the longer that this broccoli waits to form a head, the larger that the plant is able to grow, the larger that head will eventually be. So I want these plants to really focus right now on just growing big and healthy. And then once they're able to support a really large broccoli head, at that point, then I'm gonna start looking for broccoli heads. So once I see the first sign of a little tiny bit of a broccoli head forming down here in the center of the plant, I'm going to give these plants a little dose of liquid fish emulsion fertilizer, and that'll help the broccoli head to really develop. Now you can see that I have some lettuce plants and some mosh that's really heavily gone to seed, just kind of interplanted along with my broccoli. I've got some Asian greens here. Over here some pak choi, which looks like it's been enjoyed by some insects. But growing the lettuce in here, kind of nestled in the broccoli, will be beneficial for both the broccoli and the lettuce. It kind of works as somewhat of a living mulch for this broccoli. And the broccoli plants will shade the lettuce, which helps it not to bolt quite so early in the season. So you can see that I've been working on trying to edge the beds with some flowers and herbs and just some things that will help provide a little more living mulch and hopefully attract some pollinators too. So along that first trellis there, I'm going to be planting my cucumbers. I actually have not planted those out yet. Last season, I had a little bit of an issue with my cucumber plants, which is basically as soon as the seeds germinated, I normally direct sow my cucumbers. So I was planting them directly at the base of the trellis. And as soon as they germinated, something was coming along and nipping the tops off every single one. Happened over and over. I think I replanted like 3 times. So this year, what I decided to do was to start my cucumbers in separate pots and transplant them out when they're a little bit larger. So I actually have them started in pots on my deck right now. And probably within a week or so, I'm going to be transplanting them out here. Now, starting them in pots on my deck was really convenient because I didn't have to use space in my house. I didn't have to worry about my grow lights. Those cucumbers are coming up already acclimated to the outdoors, just as they would if they'd been direct sown out here. But this way, they're in pots on my deck where I can monitor them a little bit. So I'm hoping that that will do the trick. So in probably a week or two, those will be planted along that trellis there. So you'll notice that quite a bit has been planted out here since the last garden tour. This is the other side of the main walkway. So this is the broccoli bed's over there, and then across the walkway from it is this other front bed here. You can see I have 3 tomato plants planted along this trellis. So this trellis this welded wire fence will just be used as a support for these tomatoes as they grow. Along this other half of the fence here, there's going to be more cucumbers, but as I said before, I have not planted those out yet. Now, I've just really gotten started with transplanting out or direct sowing, depending on the situation, a lot of these little companion plants out here. You can see I've got some purple alyssum here, some little chamomile. This is an Alaska red shades nasturtium, and look at how beautiful the variegation in those leaves is. So these are supposed to have a nice deep red flower, but even with just the foliage, they're really beautiful already. Got some purple ball basil. It's a little baby zinnia. And then through here you can see I've got more basils, more zinnias, calendula, lots of things that should. A little bit of dill there and some cosmos in the back. So I'm hoping that these will help support my main crops here, help them to be more healthy. So actually the primary crop that I'm planning to grow in that front bed there is actually zucchini. So I did just sow those zucchini seeds a couple days ago. I think that video it'll be either the one right before or the right after this. I'm not sure exactly what order I'm going to publish them in yet. But that zucchini has not started coming up yet. I just planted it a couple days ago. And my hope is that by growing zucchini basically in front of the tomatoes, it's going to provide a living mulch for the tomatoes. It's also by growing all these companion plants around the zucchini, that should help draw in pollinators. You know, zucchini, squashes, cucumbers, melons, plants like that that have separate male and female flowers really heavily rely on pollinators to make sure that they produce for you. So especially with plants like that, I wanted to make extra sure that I've got lots of pollinator attracting plants mixed in there. And you can see on the other side of the same bed here, I don't have any zucchinis that have come up here yet, but I do have lots of flowers and herbs that are started. So moving along to this bed here, this is my tomato bed. You can see that I have them on the back side of the fence this year. Last year I planted them on the front and that was not a great, I didn't have a lot of success with that. The tomatoes themselves actually did really well being planted on the front of the trellis last year, but because I planted peppers on the back, the tomato plants got so large they really shaded out my pepper plants. So this year, because tomato plants are so much larger than peppers, I'm putting the tomatoes on the back. The peppers will go in that bare area that you saw in the front. I'm gonna wait to plant my peppers for another week or two because peppers really do not like temperatures even at nighttime to go below about 50 degrees. And well, a fair amount of my nights have been above 50. We have had a few in the 40s. So my pepper plants are on my deck hardened off, but I still like to be able to bring them in for some cooler nights. So hopefully pretty soon I'll be able to get those out in the garden. Now here's a closer look at the tomatoes along the trellis. You can see that I've been tying them up with this little tomato tape. I find that really easy to use. It's nice because it's flexible, so as the tomato plant grows, it's not going to dig into the stem or damage the stem the way some tying materials might be prone to do. So I've got 6 tomatoes planted along this fence here, which is probably slightly closer spacing than recommended, but that's what I have decided to do. You can see I've got some basil, marigolds, other little plants planted around here just to be friends with the tomatoes. So in that kind of bare area in front of the tomato plants over here, you could see that I did have quite a few companion plants planted already. I have also direct sowed some seeds for some zucchini over here. It's kind of the same idea that I mentioned with the other trellis. The idea is that the zucchini will get really large, it'll cover the ground really nicely and basically provide a living mulch for the tomatoes. A lot of times companion plants that have really different growth habits are the ones that you want to pair together. For example, because I am trellising these tomatoes are going to grow really tall. They're not going to have a very large footprint as far as how much ground they take up. The zucchini will be the opposite. Those are going to be really large and spread out and not going to get very tall. So because of those kind of complementary growth styles, I'm hoping that these will make good companion plants for each other. So definitely stay tuned and see how that works out. The one thing that I am a little bit hesitant about when it comes to that is, as I mentioned last year, the tomato plants shaded out the peppers that were on the side of the trellis. It is possible that they're going to shade out the zucchini as well. So I'm kind of experimenting and we'll see how that plays out as the season goes on. So moving on to this next bed over here, you can see this is also tomatoes. So I have 6 more tomato plants planted along this arched trellis here. So these are spaced probably between 15 and 18 inches apart, which as I mentioned is slightly closer spacing than recommended. I have found though that in my area, I've experimented with growing my tomatoes with wider spacing and it didn't really seem to make a big difference as far as disease. So I figure if disease is going to hit at about the same time, no matter how I space them, I might as well space them a little closer and get a little more harvest in that small space. Now you'll notice that I only have my tomatoes planted on one side of this trellis here. On the back there are no tomato plants. That's intentional because when you're growing tomato plants and trying to keep them healthy, one of the most important considerations is airflow. And if I planted tomato plants growing up both sides of this trellis, then they really wouldn't get the ideal amount of airflow and they'd be a lot more prone to disease. So it really is better to grow your tomato plants on just one side of the trellis and then plant something else on the other side. So on this back side of the trellis here, I'll have peppers again. So this will be all filled with peppers. The other tomato bed across the aisle over there will also have peppers all on this side. So as I said, I'm waiting for the ground to warm up a little bit, for the night temperatures to warm up a little bit, and then we'll go ahead and get peppers planted out here. Now over here, my garlic is doing really well. You can see that it's growing nicely into really large plants. It shouldn't be too long before we start getting garlic scapes. I don't think that this is a garlic scape yet. No, this is still a leaf. See how I can open it up? But in here, I should be getting garlic scapes really soon. And that will be the first delicious garlic harvest of the season. So moving over here, I have some cherry tomatoes over here. Now you'll notice that I do have my cherry tomatoes growing in tomato cages. While I'm not a big fan of tomato cages for most indeterminate tomatoes, I don't think they really provide enough support and the plants can really get too tall. I do use them for my cherry tomatoes. Honestly, the cherry tomatoes would probably do better if I grew them on a trellis wall similar to my slicer tomatoes, but I don't have enough space to do that, and the cherry tomatoes really do okay in these tomato cages here. Because their fruit isn't as heavy, the plants will still get really large, they will still have a lot of fruit, but because each individual fruit is pretty light and easy for the plant to support, I find that these tomato cages do okay for them. Now you'll notice that I do still have the walls of water around these tomatoes. Basically, a couple weeks ago, we had a random really late frost, and I had not planted the majority of my tomato plants yet. I had planted a few of them. So the plants that were planted, I was not going to take any risk on losing them to frost. So I came out here and I set up these are called walls of water. Sometimes you'll see it called a water-filled cloche or something like that. This works really well to insulate plants against the late frost. I'm really glad I did that because it ended up, my forecast said that it was going to get down to 34 degrees at night, which you know is slightly above freezing, but it was close enough that I didn't want to take a risk. It actually got down to 30 degrees. So I am really glad that I ended up protecting my tomato plants. And as you can see, they pulled through amazingly. They look great. So I'm just waiting to take these off until it's very unlikely that we'll get another cold night. But these aren't hurting my tomatoes at all. So I'm just going to leave them on for a few more days, probably take them off sometime this week. You can see these did really well. Now look at this. This is a red centiflora cherry tomato, and this bud cluster looks really promising. This plant was listed as being a really high producer, and based on the first bud cluster, I'm going to say I think it's likely that the advertising was correct. So you can see these other cherry tomatoes back here are also looking really good in their walls of water. Now these tomatoes here that are not in the walls of water, I planted these slightly later. You can see the plants are a little bit smaller. That's just because they got in the ground a little bit later than the others. So those will catch up in no time. Now over here, this one I believe is a Berry's Crazy Cherry. You can see that's got flowers down there. So we should be getting tomatoes on this pretty soon too. We already looked at this bed, but I mentioned how I was using zucchini to kind of be a living mulch for my tomato plants, and I noticed the first one has sprouted right here. So I can't remember off the top of my head what zucchini variety that is. I know I planted a few. I'll have to go back and check my garden notes and find out about that. So over here is my random kind of herb bed. See, this chamomile is looking really good. I'm thinking it won't be long before we get some flowers from that. I planted a couple tulsi or holy basil plants out here. Got some parsley. The dill's looking really good. I've planted a couple roselle plants here. You know, I've got one back there. So I tried growing roselle last year for the first time. Roselle is sometimes also called hibiscus, and that is where hibiscus that you'll find in hibiscus tea comes from. You know, if you get any of those like zinger teas or something like that, it's hibiscus that gives them that color and that zing. So I'm trying to grow some of those for tea. I did try growing one last year. I put it in a pot on my deck. The plant got huge. It looked really healthy, but it never produced flowers for me. And the part that you harvest is what's called the calyx, which is actually the part that is left behind after the flower drops its petals. So in order to be able to harvest it for tea, you need it to flower. It never actually flowered for me. So I don't know if that's just because my growing season wasn't long enough. So if you've ever grown roselle or hibiscus before, I'm curious to hear how your experience was and if you have any tips for me, because I am trying to grow as many herbs for tea as possible myself. I really like being able to harvest a lot of my own herbal teas. So if you have any tips for growing that, definitely let me know. So over here you can see my kale's growing in really nicely. Cabbages are looking good. They're still small. No signs of a cabbage head yet, but hopefully it won't be too long before they get big enough and start heading up. So you can see I've got a variety of kales growing through here. And here is my random carrot that overwintered. Carrots are biennial. So what happens is the first year they'll produce a root for you. And if you let them overwinter and go to seed, the next year they'll flower and they'll produce a bunch of seeds for you. So as you can see, this flower, it's not open yet, but it looks like it's kind of similar to like a wild Queen Anne's lace, which is actually related to the cultivated carrot. I'm going to let this go to seed and try to collect some carrot seeds. So I think that this one is a black nebula carrot. I did have 2 types of carrots growing over here last year, but I'm pretty sure that this one's black nebula, which is a deep, rich purple. Now over here, you can see some of my kale has definitely gone to flower. I think it's actually really pretty looking, but I'm letting it go to flower so I can collect seeds. And over here, cauliflower. Now my cauliflower looks like we're going to get some mixed results. This plant looks really healthy, and I'm thinking I should get a cauliflower head. There shouldn't be any signs of it yet, but I'm just going to go in here and check. No sign of it yet, so that's good. We want it to get a little bigger first. And I've got a couple other cauliflower plants back there, which they all seem smaller than this one. This one, I have high hopes for this one. I'm not sure what I'll get from the others, but we'll see what happens. And I'm thinking, you see I have all this bare ground here between these cauliflowers. I'm thinking this is where I'm going to succession sow my next lettuce patch. So I'll probably come out here in the next couple days and just direct sow a lot of lettuce seeds there. So over here is my lettuce bed. As you can see, the lettuce looks really lush and beautiful. You can see that we have been harvesting some of this lettuce. See that it's a little bit uneven because some of it's been cut. Some of that red lettuce back there. So you can see that I've grown my lettuce really thickly. Lots of plants really packed into a small space. Because I like to harvest this basically. I don't like to come out and pick a whole head of lettuce. I like to come out and harvest a mixture of baby greens. So when I harvest this lettuce, I just bring out a pair of scissors and I just kind of cut down a certain part of the patch of lettuce and harvest a handful of leaves. Then the next time I go to harvest, I'll take the next section and the next section. And by the time I get through all these different varieties and all the different sections, the original patch that I harvested will have regrown enough to get a second harvest. So by doing that, you're able to, or at least that's how I prefer to do it. So I feel like I'm really able to extend my lettuce harvesting season that way to get the most harvest possible for the longest amount of time possible. So I always like to grow a variety of colors and textures and leaf types. And can we just take a minute to appreciate how incredibly dark this lettuce is? This is super red romaine, and I think it's really beautiful. I've got Merlot over here, which is similarly dark. This is really pretty too. And I really like the pop of color that these add. If I harvest, so this over here is Butter Crunch. This is my favorite lettuce. If I harvest a salad of Butter Crunch and then mix in some of this oak leaf for texture, some of this red romaine or this speckled lettuce or this Merlot for color, it just makes a really delicious salad. Here I've got Marvel of Four Seasons, which is similar to Butter Crunch, but it's got a little bit of a red tinge. It is pretty bolt resistant, so this should go, so hopefully this will go a while for me in the summer. So here I've got some speckled Amish. I didn't get a lot of germination from this seed packet this year, but the ones I did get look really beautiful. This lettuce here is actually overwintered. This was planted last fall. You can see that it's starting to bolt now. See how it's starting to get that center stalk? So once the day length gets a lot longer and the temperatures get higher, lettuce will bolt. It's going to send up a center stalk like that, and it's going to switch its focus from leaf production to seed production. So what's going to happen with this lettuce is you could see that it's pretty significantly bolted. It's got that really defined center stalk, and it's getting tall. So what's going to happen is in the middle of that lettuce stalk, it's going to produce some flower clusters. And what happens when your lettuce bolts? It stops producing new leaves, and the flavor of the leaves that are there turns really bitter. So it's not really useful for harvesting anymore. I am going to let this lettuce go to seed because I want to collect seeds from it. I was really happy with this lettuce. It was a really delicious lettuce, and the fact that it overwintered in my climate with minimal protection means that it is a good hardy lettuce. So if I save seeds from that lettuce, I'll be basically preserving the genetic line of this specific lettuce, and eventually I'll be selecting to grow a lettuce that does really well in my winter. So, or at least that's what should happen in theory. So I am going to save seeds from that lettuce, and we'll see what happens. Now, comfrey plants in flower are so pretty, I think. They get really tall and really majestic. All these purple flowers are so pretty. The bees really love them. They're great for attracting pollinators. So I really love when the comfrey flowers. So I wanted to start in this main garden today for a little bit of variety, because I know the last few garden tours we have been starting in the new garden expansion. But before we head over there, I just want to take a look at the peas, how they're growing, and then we'll head over to the new garden. You can see the peas are getting really tall, climbing up the fence. I would say it's probably going to be any day that we'll start getting some flowers on these. And once peas flower, it seems like it's only a couple days before you actually get harvestable peas. The chives are flowering, and these, of course, look really beautiful. So chive flowers are actually really delicious. They have a really mild onion flavor mixed with a little bit of sweetness, and they're really good in salads. Oh, and that one was especially pungent, but it's usually a pretty mild onion flavor. So I like to harvest a flower head like this and just sprinkle it on top of the salad. And when it's mixed with your salad and salad dressing, it just gives a little bit of oniony bite to your salad. It's really good. Now, a lot of people do like to use chive flowers in other ways. I've seen recipes for basically mixing these in butter and making basically a compound butter with chives. If you have done that, or you have any recipes for that, I would love to get those recipes, because I get quite a few chive flowers. I have chives in a handful of areas on my property, and while I really like sprinkling them in salads, you can only do that with so many flowers before the flowers are gone. So if you have other ways that you love to use chive flowers, go ahead and let me know in the comments, because I would like to get some more ways to use those. As you can see, all down this fence here, we've got peas growing. They look really healthy, and I can't wait to harvest those first delicious snap peas. So let's just take a look and admire those beautiful irises while they bloom. Irises seem so fleeting. They don't bloom for that long, but while they bloom, they're beautiful. So randomly, look at this weird little lily. It's so short and tiny, and it's got these little white flowers. I just planted it this spring, so I'm assuming that's why it is blooming at such a short height. So those lilies were kind of an impulse buy. I was at Home Depot walking down the aisles, and they had a bag of beautiful lily bulbs there. And those are not they were incorrectly labeled, because lilies are supposed to be basically black, a really dark maroon mahogany color that basically looks black in some lights. And I just wanted that real dramatic richness in the garden. And those are pretty much the opposite. They're basically like a creamy white. They're still pretty, but I am curious to see. That's the only bulb that has bloomed so far from that bag. So I'm curious to see if the others are going to be the black that I thought I was purchasing, or if the entire bag was mislabeled. So hopefully within the next couple days we'll get some more blooms, and hopefully some of them will be black like I thought I was buying. So the raspberries look great and very, very lush. Getting some little buds in here. So pretty soon this whole area will be filled with bees pollinating these raspberries for me, and then it won't be too long before I actually get to harvest them. So let's head down the end of the raspberry patch. And down here, these are some gold potatoes I have growing in these buckets here, and I'm really impressed with how these are looking. So if you'll remember, when we planted these potatoes together, they did not look impressive. They did not look like they were really going to do much. The gold potatoes had been in storage longer than ideal. They were shriveled up, and they basically looked like tiny little raisins with really long stalks coming out of them. They probably had a couple feet of growth on them, and I really was not all that hopeful for them. But now that I've gotten them in the ground, they actually look incredibly healthy. So I'm hoping that they will actually produce a good harvest for us. We'll see what happens as the season goes on, but so far I'm pretty hopeful about them. So I am so excited about how this new garden is looking so far. Let's head on up to the new garden and take a closer look. So first of all, I'm really happy, pleasantly surprised actually, with how this little walkway area turned out. Now, my husband did end up fixing this stone wall to some extent, probably the best it could be fixed. And basically, for the purpose of leveling, I installed, you can see I've got some bricks under there with some pavers on top as a little walkway. And then I just planted some herbs along the edge here. I've got some thyme, that's lavender. And then up here, I need to get some kind of perennial to go in this corner here. I'm not quite sure what to get yet, but you can see we've got some stepstones with more herbs. So I've got a creeping thyme, lavender, sage, lavender, oregano. My hope is to find more of this little low-growing, hello Milo, My hope is to find more of this low-growing little creeping thyme here and plant some of that between all the pavers and eventually have that fill in. But the nursery that I bought that from was out of this, so I can either be really patient, wait for this to spread and divide it, or I can try to find some more. So there's clearly something happening over in my chicken coop behind me. I'm not sure if everyone just decided to lay an egg at once or something startled them. They're all there, they're fine, but they've decided to be very excited about something all at the same time. So, in case you hear that noise in the background, that is my chickens. So this front bed here, this is my smaller raised bed, 6x3. This is ultimately going to be a second strawberry bed, but for this year, I put 4 tomatoes in here. Now you can see, once again, tomato cages. My goodness, I apologize for the rudeness of my chickens. I do not know what's going on over there. So I know we just talked about in the main garden how tomato cages are not really the ideal support for tomatoes. This here is one of those situations where I'm just not going to do things in the ideal way. You'll find in gardening, often you can do things in the not ideal way and it's not ideal, but it still a lot of times will get the job done. So these over here, I had extra tomato cages. These tomatoes needed some kind of support. This is not going to be a permanent tomato bed, so I didn't want to install a trellis wall or anything like that over here. This is only a tomato bed for this year. I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen with it next year, but ultimately this is going to be converted into a strawberry bed. Once my existing strawberry bed makes a lot of runners that need somewhere to go, they'll be moved over here. So for the meantime, because I didn't have strawberry runners, I'm not going to let this sit empty. So I put some tomatoes in here along with lots of basil and some other flowers. So just for this year in a pinch, these tomato cages will do the trick. They won't be ideal, but they'll be good enough. Now along the edge of this trellis here, you can see at the end of this tomato bed, I have not planted them yet, but I will be planting melons along this end. And also along this end, I'll be throwing a couple melon seeds in too. So I think I'm going to do probably mini cantaloupes on one side of the trellis and probably Kajari melons on the other side. So we'll see how that goes. I've never grown either of those with a great deal of success, but we'll be trying again this year. And hopefully we'll get some delicious sweet melons to snack on this summer. Now over here, the asparagus is coming up really well. Now you'll notice in this asparagus bed, there's a couple tasks I have to do. I have to weed it, obviously. You can see there's many violets coming up and some other plants as well in the asparagus bed. And look how these ferns are really opening up. The other thing I have to do is, you can see how there's kind of a hump in the middle of this bed here. That needs to be smoothed out. Planting directions for the asparagus, which I just planted this spring, a little over a month ago, said to dig a trench, lay the asparagus down in it, and then gradually add the dirt back in as the asparagus grows. So I piled the soil up in the middle, and as the asparagus grows, I'm going to be smoothing that back over the asparagus, and after that's done, I'm probably going to top it with 1 inch or 2 of compost. So this bed will be sweet potatoes. Just like peppers, it's a little cool for them to come out yet. You can see I have a few random violets that have come up, so I'm going to have to pull those out. And along the trellis here, I have planted some noodle beans. So this trellis here that I'm under spans the walkway between that sweet potato bed and the strawberry bed, which is behind me. So on both sides of that trellis, I've planted seeds for noodle beans. Mostly I've planted Chinese red noodle bean seeds with a couple green noodle bean seeds mixed in. So it shouldn't be too long. I planted those maybe a week or so ago. It shouldn't be too long before we start seeing some germination there. And I can't wait until this whole trellis is covered with noodle beans. It's going to be really beautiful. Well, I've never actually grown noodle beans before, but based on the photos and videos I've seen of other people growing them, they're going to be beautiful. So in the back here, I've got 2 more raised beds. You can see I've got some stakes. Those are ultimately going to be part of the fence, which we need to install. And we've got 1 more trellis here. So let's head over and take a closer look at these potatoes. This potato bed, I think, is the most abundant looking growth in my entire garden right now. So this potato bed is a mix of red potatoes and gold potatoes. This end in front of me is all red potatoes, and behind me there's some gold potatoes. So ideally, this potato bed would get a little bit more sun than it's getting. So I'm hoping that despite the kind of partial sun that it does get, I'm hoping that we'll still be able to get a really good harvest from these potatoes. But so far, they're growing with a lot of abundance, and I'm hoping that that will translate to an abundant harvest also. So along this trellis here will be planted, or I did plant actually, it hasn't come up yet, but I sowed some seeds for winter squash. So I've got a mix of butternut squash and honey nut squash. So let's continue over to this last garden bed here. See, these nasturtiums look beautiful. Now I've got 2 tomatoes here. You'll recognize those same walls of water that I had in the other garden bed. And there's a lot going on in this garden, including a fair amount of weeds. But this chamomile looks really pretty. Now a lot of these weeds look to be either chickweed or white clover, and I've decided that I'm honestly just going to let those grow and make a nice living mulch. Through here you can see I've got some bachelor's buttons, which shouldn't be too long till they bloom. Got some carrots mixed in, along with a lot of onions along the edge here. Now in both of these corners here, neither one has germinated yet, but in both of those corners I have planted sugar pie pumpkins. So winter squash, of which sugar pie pumpkins are a type, really vine and spread out and take up a lot of space. So my hope is that by planting them in the corner of the bed, I'm going to try to encourage them to vine out over the walkway, and then their footprint in the actual raised bed should, in theory, be pretty small. So as long as they vine out over the walkway, they can spread out and take up pretty much as much space as they want. I can get pumpkins out here and still retain the majority of my raised bed area for growing other things. Now over here in this little corner, basically I added an extra little random corner of wood chips and walkway because if I followed this straight line here, we'd meet up here, and then this last little bit of my blackberry bed would be outside the garden. So I decided, rather than doing that, to just add this little triangle of wood chips. And I decided to put a little trio of pots here. One in the back I raised up on a little bit of a stump just to add some visual interest. Obviously, I've only planted one of them so far, but I'm thinking that this will add a nice little touch of whimsy and beauty to this corner of the garden. Tell me what you guys are thinking. Over here, I have the same type of situation. You can see I've got the walkway here. Over here is the asparagus patch. So the end of this garden is really here, but the asparagus patch continues on. I was considering doing the same thing and basically adding a little triangle of wood chips here and maybe another trio of pots. So let me know, would you do that, or is there something different you'd do with this little corner? So I just wanted to take a minute to appreciate the beauty of this gorgeous lilac bush. So this huge lilac bush was here when we purchased the house. This was planted by the previous owner. And it doesn't have quite as concentrated of a smell as the lilac bush that I planted that I've showed you guys in a previous video. But just because of the huge size of this bush, I can't even get it all on the camera screen, I don't think. Just because of the huge size of it, it's beautiful, and even though the smell is a lot lighter, because there's so many flowers, it really does perfume this whole backyard. So I've really been enjoying it. As you can see, some of the blooms are kind of starting to be on the way out. So I wanted to make sure to show you guys while it's still here. So thank you so much for joining me in the garden today on this beautiful spring morning, just for taking a walk through the garden and spending some time with me seeing how the plants are growing. I hope that your garden is doing really well too. I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you again soon. I'll see you next time.